This is Openwork, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Gabe Reilly, co-founder of Collective.
Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Speak Marine, James Lamb, Zeitwinkel, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
On this episode, we're going behind the scenes on the making of our latest collaboration, the Armin Strom Gravity Equal Force Night Ops. Probably the question we're asked the most is how we design and develop our collaborative watches, how we identify brands, how the creative process works, and how we make decisions along the way on everything from design to finishing. So in this episode, we're going to do exactly that.
But wait, Gabe, I thought we weren't going to do this.
Well, we are, but before we get to that in the controversy or the tempest in the teapot, I just want to say this episode we're not going to talk so much about the features, the specifications, or review the watch. If you're interested in this watch, it's available at collectivehorology.com. We have all the specifications. We have tons of awesome photography from our friend Zach Pena. And we also have a bunch of hands-on content, including videos and all sorts of stuff. So if you're interested in the watch, go there to learn about it. I think the point here is really we could be talking about any watch here. We happen to be talking about the Armin Strom because this is the collaboration that's launching today. And side note, the podcast is launching one day late. We usually launch on Mondays. It's launching on a Tuesday today to coincide with the launch of the watch. But we're really just using this watch as kind of a case study in our creative process and how we work with brands to make collaborative watches, since people seem to really want to know about it. So Asher, to your point, we've shied away from that topic in the past. That's the controversy here. We've sort of been coy and we've avoided really getting into specifics about how we work on this stuff. And we've sort of decided, you know what, to heck with it. We're going to go whole hog here and we're going to tell everyone how we do the things that we do. Why?
I truly have no idea.
Is this a terrible mistake?
It might be.
Is this like giving away the recipe to Dr. Pepper?
Prunes.
Okay.
Prunes.
Now, so if everyone knows Dr. Pepper is a prune-based beverage, we might as well talk about how we work. But all jokes aside, we have kind of avoided really going into detail on how we work, and I think it is worth talking about why we've done that and why we decided to change that today.
Well, if we're going to do this, might as well give a little context. I think we've mentioned a few times on the pod that our former industries were marketing and advertising. And, you know, putting aside whatever your feelings may be about the marketing and advertising industry, positive, negative, completely don't care. One of the things that I think is a remarkable thing, and Gabe has a lot more experience in this part of the business than I do, is how creative, so in other words, how advertising and the literal advertising itself is developed, has a very rigorous process and a very specific approach. And at the highest order, without being jargony, it's essentially about pruning things down from one core idea until you get to the absolute best possible execution that you can bring to life based off of what somebody would refer to as the brief. Gabe, you want to explain what a creative brief is?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm the guy who gets to explain what a creative brief is. This is literally what my job was for years before I moved into the tech industry and then selling watches. So the creative brief is basically for any advertising campaign, and an advertisement or an advertising campaign is really just an expression of an idea. It's a manifestation of an idea. And the brief is the single piece of paper where that idea starts. It's a distillation of the key message or the key idea a brand is trying to create. And so we cribbed that process of writing a creative brief to develop our collaborative watches, not because that was some sort of genius idea, but it was the approach that we knew and we were comfortable with. So the way we look at the process of developing a watch in broad strokes is we're going to make a watch. We want the watch to have a unique reason for being. We don't want it just to be a color change or some other variation on an existing watch. We really want anyone who sees the watch to be able to look at it and feel something, or even better, look at it and say, oh, I understand what they're going for here. This watch looks like A, B, or C. It conveys an idea. And so to do that, we use this process of starting with a creative brief, because not only is it what we know, but the idea of starting with a really clear, single-minded idea helps us make decisions along the way as well. Because as anyone who anyone who loves and knows watches knows, there are a lot of decisions to make along the way. There are hundreds of components in any watch, and that means you can use different parts, you can finish them differently, you can make all sorts of choices about how to design a watch, and sometimes it can get a bit out of control. And so the benefit of the brief is it gives clarity of an idea, but it also gives discipline along the way to sort of rein us in and help us make sure that we're not overdoing it. Because I think there's a temptation with collaborations to want to overdo it.
There's an interesting point that you're bringing up, which is the idea of what makes something your own. And that applies both to, individual choices around like bespoke clothing, or even if you choose to have a watch made exclusively for yourself, versus coming up with an idea that has to apply to 10, 50, 20, 100, 200 watches and speak to a concept that was derived but also very clearly executed through a watchmaker. And I think that's why, for a long time, and I still maintain, we've said we are not watch designers. We're not. And I know that for a fact because when I sit across from a real watch designer, like Lee over at Fears, or the guys we're going to talk about today at Claude, at Armin Strom, et cetera, they have a very particular understanding in a much more detailed way than I do of what can be brought to life on the canvas of a watch. But the way that we approach it, as Gabe has mentioned it, is really to say, like, all right, well, we want to evoke a concept, an idea, or a feeling. So let's be specific about that. Let's talk for a moment about Chapek, because I think that was actually a really clear example before we talk a bit more about Armin Strom, because these are two very different watch companies, two very different ideas. With Chapek, at the time, we really wanted to create a sports watch that was going to evoke Hawaiian water sport. That was where it started. And there was a lot of reasons why we felt it wasn't an appropriate thing for us to make that watch. Neither of us are surfers or competitive longboaters or, any other form of sport that's endemic to Hawaii.
What is longboating?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think you're conflating longboarding and outrigger canoeing.
Outrigger canoeing. That's what I mean. Thank you.
But
Pardon
if
me.
you needed proof that we are neither of those things, now you have it.
Exactly. But the reason why, among other reasons, is that Gabe in particular, you can tell it's not me, has a real passion for Hawaii, spent a lot of time there, and it's a very important place to him. And that idea ended up becoming much more refined down to this idea of, well, there is a very particular quality to the water in Hawaii, and a very particular beach in our mind really brought that to life in a particular way. So the way we went to Chapek wasn't to say, we want you to go to Dunsey Cadron and create a very specific enamel dial in this particular way, blah, blah, blah. No, what we said to them is we want to make a Antarctique that brings to life the feeling of peering down into the water at Lanikai Beach in Hawaii, and that beautiful crystal clear water shimmering as you look down. Let's make that. And that is where it gets handed off to the quote-unquote professionals, and the iterative process begins. And I think the iterative process is really something that we've borrowed heavily from the advertising industry. And it's one that, like, I'll be completely candid with you, like the watch industry isn't as familiar with in our experience of working with some brands, because in many cases, folks will, and if anyone on this podcast has ever done, say, like a club watch or something like that, usually, you may bring something to them and they go, cool, and they mock it up for you and you decide if you like it or you don't, and that's kind of it. But for us, we often go through 5, 6, 7, 10, sometimes more than that, revisions on mock-ups, designs, and prototypes until we get to exactly where we want to be, which is a really important point to bring up because that requires a great deal of time, effort, spec work, and patience on behalf of both Collective and the watchmaker. And the truth is, like, not everybody's down for that. And that's not like a comment that I make with any form of grumpiness. Working for free is hard, and not everybody has the time, the resources, or the inclination to do it. But that's what's involved in making something that has been refined, iterated, and brought down. By the way, this speaks to some of the points that we've made in previous episodes about why watches cost what they cost, et cetera. It's that iterative process, that's time. And if you're a doctor or a lawyer listening on this, you're probably nodding your head along, I would hope, because you guys get compensated for your time. People who design watches don't, at least in this context. So that iteration is done in service of a greater idea and the hope that it will land, but it doesn't guarantee success.
I want to change gears and talk specifically about Armin, because I think it'll be a really good case study where we can kind of go from beginning to end about how we do this. But I do want to come back to this thing we started with, which is this isn't something we've really spoken about in great detail. And I think, like a slippery politician, Asher, you avoided the question nicely, but I do want to put a finer point on it, which is I think in the past we felt like, oh gosh, if we tell people exactly how we design watches, we're giving away our secret sauce. We're going to lose our competitive advantage, or anyone can then come in and do this. And I think two things. One, we don't have a monopoly on collaborative watches. There are a lot of collaborative watches out there that are awesome. And there are a lot of different approaches to doing collaborative watches. There are some folks who approach collaborative watchmaking in a different way than we do, say like a very design-driven way. Someone who we love and admire and is an incredibly talented designer is George Bamford. Mm-hmm. And he has an aesthetic in a lot of ways. He doesn't always, but generally Bamford has kind of a house style, and that house style and George's aesthetic and his design abilities make fantastic collaborative watches. It's a different way of doing it that holds no more or less value than our approach. So I think that's an important thing. Like, we don't have a monopoly on this. And two, the other thing we've talked about on previous podcasts is this is really hard. And not only does developing a collaborative watch require some sort of process to do, but it takes a lot of time. It takes resources. We wholesale the watches that we do as collaborations. It is quite literally for us a full-time job. We did have, when we started this business, other jobs we did in addition to Collective. We both now do this 100%. This is our job. This is our career. And so it is a very deep investment of time, which is to say, at the same time as we don't have a monopoly on this, there is a very real barrier to entry that we've realized, which makes me comfortable kind of sharing the details about how exactly we do this.
Yeah, and I think as we pivot back to Armin Strom, it's good to sort of take a moment and look at the moment in time when we originally pitched this. And I think what would be great is let's go through the process starting in I guess it was the end of 2020, really, maybe early 2021, when the watch came out in 2020. Yeah, so I guess it was the end of 2020 when we started this process. Everyone, there's a lot of things about 2020 we don't need to go back to, but I think one of the things we can recall is it was a jubilant and fabulous time in Watchland. But as we look at the interest that was growing in the independent space, Armin Strom was still kind of a brand that I think was proving to people why it deserved their attention. And I first got my hands on an Armin Strom by buying a Gravity Equal Force from our friend Pietro at the limited edition. He did a beautiful Gravity Equal Force with them in 2019, I believe, to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the limited edition. And I fell in love with the architecture of the watch and the design and the style. The finishing is unique, but what's truly distinct about Armin Strom, if you've never taken a close look, is their incredible and unique approach to high-end watchmaking, which is essentially to put technicality and functionality at the forefront. And that's not a dig on their finishing, which is top-notch, but they really think about things from the technical side of the house. And when we approached them, the idea of doing 30 pieces was ambitious, to say the least. But we did it, and we set that up because A, that was what the economics required, and B, because we believed in drawing attention to the maker. And we had our first conversation, I remember, with Serge, who's the CEO of the company. And that first conversation goes a lot of different ways with a lot of different brands. And with him, I think it really was trying to understand and vet us. Are we serious about the commitment and what the involvement in doing this? How are we going to market this watch? How are we going to sell it? Who are we? Because at that point, we'd only been around for 2 years. And that was really sort of the impetus of the conversation. Of course, the next stage of that is always, well, okay, what did you have in mind? And usually brands approach us and say, okay, well, what watch do you want to work with? Or how much money do you want the watch to cost? And we always sort of pull back a little bit at that, because if we really are going to operate on a creative basis, you don't want to really decide what watch you're working with until you know what the idea is, because you may determine that, if we had decided, say, if we had just, said we're going to do, a resonance with them, and then the concept didn't apply to the resonance, we're kind of stuck. But if we say, like, let's focus on the resonance, then we can imagine which is going to be the best watch to articulate that. It plays out well. So that was our second conversation. Like, well, what do you have in mind here? And like, how's that going to work? We're not going to get into this part of it, but in parallel to this too, it's also important to note there's a creative conversation, there's a commercial conversation. Because as you continue to develop the creative idea, you're also trying to figure out what the commercial relationship is going to be between you and that brand. And in 2020, we were not authorized dealers of anybody. So everything was a one-off contractual agreement, or in many cases, believe it or not, a handshake, which is remarkable when you consider the extraordinary value of a lot of these objects. So you have that conversation going on the one hand, and the second conversation of, all right, we've decided to work together. We've identified the watch. What do you want to do? And that led us to how we approached the brief with Armin.
It's easy to say, well, every watch should have a creative concept and have an idea. And you talked about the Chapek, and anyone I show our Chapek collaboration to requires no explanation. You show them the watch and like, oh, I get it. That's the Ocean. And it's important to have a clear idea, but it's also important to have an idea that is relevant to the brand. One idea might be a perfect fit for one particular brand and one watch, and it may not work at all for another brand and another watch. So another vector we have to consider when developing ideas is not just what do we think is cool and what do we want to do, or what would be interesting, but what is something that would kind of enhance what's already there. What is something that would complement this watchmaker and what they do, but take it in a slightly different direction, or take it in a direction that we're really curious about and keen on. So that was where the conversation started between me and you, Asher, which is, well, what do we really like and what do we really love about Armin Strom? What do we think here is so special? And what we landed on was this very technical approach to watchmaking. I think they call it transparent engineering or something like that. They do skeletonization, and it's not for its own sake. When they do skeletonization or the open working of their watches, it's to showcase kind of the core movement technology within the watch. So in the case of the gravity equal force, they're showcasing the micro rotor and they're showcasing the constant force mechanism on the dial. And so it's a cohesive thought. And we really liked that very technical approach to watchmaking. So we started to say, what are some concepts that could draw that out, that could really highlight what we find so interesting and compelling? And actually, we landed on and we brought them 3 very different ideas. It wasn't just one idea. And so we developed essentially 3 ideas, and then mood boards, write-ups, and initial thoughts on what watch might be appropriate, what colors and finishes might be appropriate, but really only as suggestions and starting points. We don't want to be so vague that we're not giving a watchmaker and a watch designer enough to work with, but we also don't want to be so prescriptive that they can't bring their own ideas and say, that's cool, have you considered this? So what we did there was brought them 3 distinct ideas. I want to share what those ideas were, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, you sure? Because like we kind of, some of those may have second lives.
One of them did have a second life, actually. And I think that's important to the transparency of it. So we brought them 3 ideas. One of them was to do a tactical approach to watchmaking, which is where we ended up going. So we drew in inspiration from tactical gear and technical outdoors gear. So if anyone knows of the brand, may they rest in peace, Triple Aught Design, we drew some inspiration from that sort of world of tactical and technical gear. And you can see that in the watch. We also brought them 2 other ideas. One was this idea of dystopian clockworks.
Mm-hmm.
So this was very much inspired by like the visual language of sort of like Mad Max,
Blade Runner,
dystopian future, because there is something about the open working of those Armin watches and the exposing of the inner clockworks that feels like they may have come from this future, a future sort of world where, you know, a crazy genius watchmaker somewhere in a bunker kind of came up with and assembled these things. And so that idea was all about kind of drawing out that quality of the watch. And then the third idea, it was around an exploration of the late 1970s, because the watch, the gravity equal force, is part of a collection that Armin Strom calls the System 78 collection. And 78 refers to the birth year of the founders of the brand. So both Serge Michel and Claude Griesler were born in 1978. They both knew each other as children growing up. And so the System 78 is a nod to the late 1970s when they were born. So we were like, could we explore this idea of the late 1970s and draw on kind of the mood and color palette of that era? That territory ended up informing what we did with Oris and the Diver 75, which is a very 1970s watch. So to your point, sometimes an idea that you have that might not be quite right for one particular brand or one particular project may come to life in a different way with a different brand. And I think our recommendation to them was to explore this tactical watchmaking world. And I think they instantly sort of resonated with that as well.
Yeah, and I think that also puts a point on, like, you know, where somebody is in their life and what's going on around them can have a significant impact on the creative things that they create. So for us, you know, again, going back to 2020, during that period of time, as all of us were looking for other things to occupy our minds, one of the things that Gabe got into ever so briefly, and I for ever so slightly longer than that got into, but ended up, you know, pivoting back to watches, was knives, pocket knives in particular. You know, everything looks affordable relative to collecting watches, and knives definitely had that. But they share a lot of elements that I think attract collectors. You know, there's certainly an incredible canvas for creativity insofar, or in the same way that watches are. And there's a lot of processes like CNC milling of parts, clips, scales, etc., and of course blades that parallel to the quality machining that we find in watches. And at the time, both Gabe and I were not just carrying pocket knives, but we were hunting down what was, you know, sort of the Daytona, if you will, of what are called mid-tech knives, which are essentially like custom-ish. You know, they're not mass produced, but they're still manufactured using CNC machines and not lathes, you know, versus like fully custom knives, which are produced to a much higher standard. Anyway, long story short, we became quite obsessed with a Midwestern knife maker called Holt Blade Works. And part of what makes Holt knives so remarkable, aside from the fact that the husband and wife couple that runs it are lovely, is the detail that they apply to the scales. So in other words, the sides of the knife and when it's sheathed, and the clips. And those were some of the inputs that we provided to Claude, because, you know, neither Gabe nor I are like tactical people per se, but this was sort of like, this was a tool that we carried around with us in Southern California, and a pocket knife is a useful tool. And that really clicked into this idea of like, well, how far can we push the idea of something that is so refined and so usually, you know, treated with incredible delicacy, like haute horology? How far can we push that into the territory of knife making, where utilitarianism and precision are much more closely aligned in you know, excluding things like, you know, Tudors and Rolex subs? And that led us to an interesting place where something happened that we've never really seen a watchmaker do before this or after this, which is that Claude came back to us not just with a recommended design, but with a completely redesigned caliber. It is, and I cannot express to you how unusual it is for a watchmaker to say, I'm going to change the architecture of a watch to better serve the creative concept that is presented to me, because there's so much time and effort and money involved in doing that. So part, by the way, as a side note, of what makes the P.03, the original version, and now the Night Ops so unique is that it has a caliber that is explicitly unique to the P.03 line, even within the System 78 and the gravity equal force. So it was an unusual and exciting experience, not just to get to work on a creative approach to a watch, but also a technical approach to a watch, which is, of course, highly germane to what makes Armin Strom so special. And also to be able to watch the technical development process, which is not really something that we tend to get to see a lot of, because if we're working with a watch, like when we were working with Oris, like the Caliber 400 is a Caliber 400. There's no insight whatsoever into how that's being built, manufactured, tested, or what have you in the context of our collaboration. It was everything else about the watch that we talked about. Whereas with Armin Strom, quite literally every element of it was specific to P.03 and now the future version, the Night Ops.
I think what's interesting here, and to be clear, is about what we shared with Claude, which was a series of images, some words, and some colors. And from that, he came back to us with a full rendering. And what he proposed in the rendering was something that drew on some of the colors, the idea, some of the finishes we expressed, but took things further. So I think to make it really clear, and I would encourage anyone, go to collectivehorology.com, check out this watch. The photos will certainly do a better job describing this than I will. But for instance, Asher, you're talking about the changes they made to the caliber. So specifically, one of the things that Claude did to the caliber was change the finishing and the milling of some of the bridges on the front of the watch. And since some of the images we provided him were of knives, one of the things he thought was really interesting was some of the milling on knife clips. So, literally the clip that secures your knife to your pocket or whatever it might be. And he thought there were some interesting milling and finishing techniques on those, and he applied that to the bridges. Another interesting example would be the scales of the knife. So, as Asher is describing, there are some very specific patterns that knife makers will use for scales on their knives, the grip of the knife. And if you look at the base plate on the dial of the watch, you'll see there's sort of like a triangular frag pattern. It's guillocheted. So those base plates are done by Komlemine, which is Kari Voutilainen's dial factory. So those are hand guillocheted plates, but they're done in the pattern of a knife scale. So those are some very specific things that Claude came back with and proposed in response to what was essentially some general creative direction, but not a specific design from us. And I think what's so cool is, and this is going to come up again, Claude kept going and going and going. So the milling, for instance, on the bridges was not something that we saw in the first render. We saw essentially the watch without any changes to those bridges in the first render. And then a few weeks later, out of nowhere, Claude came back and emailed us and said, I have another idea here. I was spending more time with the reference material you provided, and that's when he sort of picked up on the knife clips, and he came back with the proposal to do that to the bridges. And that's what I think is so cool about independent watchmaking. This is not a job for Claude. This is his livelihood. This is his vocation. He's a master watchmaker. He is a co-founder of Armin Strom. This is his baby. He doesn't stop thinking about it. The creative process, the watchmaking process, the engineering process, it doesn't end. He goes to bed thinking about this and wakes up in the morning thinking about this. And all of these very deliberate design decisions weren't all made at once. These were the result of him sort of gestating the process and continuing to refine it and continuing to push it along the way. And I think this was something we saw in other projects we've done as well. Chapek, with their insistency that those enamel dials be perfect, and taking 3 years to refine the technique with Dosé Cadran to do that. Urwerk.
Yep.
Martin Fry.
Yep.
This guy was making changes to the design of the watch literally up until the day we launched the thing, because it's a living and breathing idea and something that these folks truly are passionate about.
Yeah, it matters to them.
Can always be better, and they want to continue to push it. And so when I look at the details of the watch, that's what I see, which is why I think it's actually cool to talk about this stuff, because someone might see it and think, oh, that finishing technique is cool. But what I really see is someone's passion expressed in a mechanical object.
Yeah, and now you're getting to the core of what I think is often misunderstood about what collaboration really is. And I think I've talked about this on other pods or something, or maybe I've just talked about it to Gabe and he's going to roll his eyes. But like, there is a difference between a limited edition and a collaboration, and there's a place for both. Like we just did a limited edition and we're really proud of it. That was our Onyx Redcliffe with Fears, where essentially it was a little bit more collaborative than most limited editions, but essentially we wanted a variant of a watch in a particular way and we ordered that. And we got a beautiful version of it because Lee and Nicholas and the whole team over at Fears won't let something out the door that isn't absolutely fabulous. But fundamentally, it wasn't conceptual. It was a variant that was specific, and we're very happy with that. But a collaboration in its most purest form and its most successful form is one where you have two parties who are equally excited to work with one another, who create something in the vocabulary of the maker, but that would never have existed without the input and partnership of the third party. That's a collaboration. And if you think about some of the collaborations that we're most excited, like that I personally really like, or that I've seen other places that really resonate with me, like one of them, for example, like a favorite collaboration of mine was that Bell and Ross Alain Silberstein that Waco and Revolution did for Grail Watch. Like that is such an improbable design that it almost shouldn't work, but for the fact that clearly the Bell and Ross creative team and Alain Silberstein, under I'm sure the guidance of Waco, brought oil and water together in a way that, my God, worked. And to me, like that is really the indicator of an awesome collaboration. And that does mean, and this is a really important part, there are going to be a lot of people out there who don't like it. And to me, like that's actually a really good indicator. Like if you release something and everyone's like, oh, cool. I'm like, maybe we didn't do a very good job here. Because in order for somebody to really get excited about it, they need to look at it and go, oh, God, no.
Yeah. When you make something for everyone, you make something for no one.
Yeah, exactly. And, so I think like, with this Gravity Equal Force, with our work, with that Alan Silberstein, with the Bamford collaboration they just did with Eric Wind last year, with, I think it was Rowing Blazers, like these are polarizing designs, but they're polarizing designs that were clearly made intentionally. And that means that the people who are going to like them, man, they're going to love them. And the people who are going to hate it, well, you guys have been on the internet. So, but that to me, like the quote hate isn't a bad thing, because it's actually an indicator that you provoked a reaction that shows that what you created actually has a point of view. And that point of view maybe doesn't work for everybody, but it was clear enough that someone was able to have a intense reaction to it one way or the other. And there's the emotional side of that, which is a whole other conversation. But there's the I think creative side of it, which is like, yeah, all right, well that worked because we were trying to provoke a reaction from a certain, from enough people to be able to find homes for all the watches, and it worked. And I think that's kind of the other side of collaboration. Those watches only exist because Way brought party A, party B together. Some of the watches that we've made only exist because of, I'm fairly confident in saying that I don't believe Armin Strom would make a watch like this had they not worked with us. And that's exactly the point. And nor would we have made this kind of a watch with anybody else.
Without them.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is always, I think, a good filter for us when we're in the midst of developing a project, of looking at this and saying like, is this recognizable as the brand that manufactured it, which is critical, right? Like we're not trying to like say, hey, it'd be really great if Breguet made a watch that looked like Rolex. You know what I mean? Like that would be weird and not cool. But what would be really interesting is if you made a watch and you're like, wow, I mean, that's a Breguet, but like never thought of it like that. By the way, full disclosure, we're not working with Breguet at the moment, but you get the idea.
Yeah, I want to put a finer point on this because you're a little dusty there, or a little rusty, which is your framework.
I might be dusty.
your framework it was like a Venn diagram with 3 circles, and the way you used to talk about it, which I thought was really smart, kudos to you, credit to Asher, was along the following lines. There's 3 things at play here. 1 is there are limited edition watches. 2, there are collaborative watches, which is just what you were describing. And then 3, there are conceptual or idea-driven watches. And for me, I look for a Venn diagram in what we do with collaborative watches that hits on all three of those circles. So for me,
that's better than what I said.
That's the sweet spot, right? Because like you can do a limited edition and it's not necessarily collaborative as you were discussing. It's like, oh, we love this watch. We wanted to do it with a red dial. So here it is with a red dial.
Mm-hmm.
Then you can do something that's a collaboration where you can see the fingerprints of both creators on the watch. And there are a lot of great examples of that. I think like a Bamford, like a really great Bamford collab would be an example of that. It's like, if not for George Bamford and this brand, like the Chopard Mille Miglia he did. I love
that was a good one.
That's a great example, right? Like you don't get that without Chopard and Bamford.
Yeah, but that's not conceptual.
And then there's this third layer, which is, is it conceptual? Does it have a core creative idea? Or does it tell a specific story? Do you look at it and go, oh, I know what that is. It's a watch from that looks like the ocean or whatever it is. And I bring this up because that's what we try to go for with every project we do. And now some maybe check all three boxes. Some don't, and we're okay with it. I mean, the Fears Onyx dial, like in transparency, we wanted to do a watch with an Onyx dial. And it's not really conceptual. Doesn't mean it's worth any more or less intellectually than the others. But that's what I think when we're at our best, that's what we go for. It's not just limited in nature. You see the fingerprints of both collaborators, but it also expresses a clear idea. My favorite example of a watch that did that is not one of our watches. It's the Zodiac Worn and Wound.
The Trapper Keeper.
The first watch they did together, the 90s. Some people call it the Saved by the Bell watch. We call it the Trapper Keeper. But that is a watch that was limited in nature, where you saw both the DNA of Zodiac and Zach Weiss of Worn and Wound sort of design philosophy at play. And you look at it and you're like, I get it. It's like it showed up in a time warp from the early 1990s, the Memphis School of Design, or it looks like the credits to Saved by the Bell. To me, that is like the holy grail of a successful collaboration. I look at that and I'm like, that's the level I want to achieve. I'm jealous of that. And that's sort of the standard to which we hold ourselves, which is cool because it doesn't need to be a really fussy or expensive watch. It just needs to have a clear and compelling idea.
Yeah. And I think that actually moves into the sort of the last phase of this, which is after you've developed this and refined it and mocked it up and prototyped it and all of that, then we're almost back to the beginning there with the brief again, because the brief comes back and it's, all right, well, how do we now tell the story of this watch? And, the funny thing is, for two guys that spent their whole life in marketing and advertising, I think we were actually in the beginning a little nervous to put our feet in as aggressively as we ended up doing it. But there's a couple of bits of work that we've done that I think I'm really proud of and I want to keep refining. And one of those was the creative campaign that we did for Oris, and one was the creative campaign that we did for Urwerk. And they couldn't have been more different. And I mean, the watches couldn't have been more different. But the thing that I liked about it, and I think what's exciting, again, from a collaborative standpoint, is like, well, how do you tell the story of a brand in a way that they themselves may not necessarily be able to do it? And I don't mean that as like they couldn't do it themselves. Of course they could. They could go out, they could hire creatives and ad agencies and do all of that. But the point is, speaking as somebody who's worked on brands, like there are limits and sort of unspoken boundaries that you don't generally cross when you're talking about yourself as a brand, but a third party can say them about you, and it actually can work. You can push some boundaries and talk and speak some truths in ways that you may not be able to do in other ways. With Oris in particular, it was really fun because we didn't really market the watch. We marketed the vibe. And that, I think, was something that we'd never really done before, but it was exactly what we wanted to do, because we realized with that watch in particular, you can't, with an Oris that I think a lot of people have seen or put their hands on or owned at one point or another, like a Diver 65, I don't really need to, and Gabe doesn't really need to like talk to you about the virtues of that watch as an object. Like you either know about it and you dig it, or it's not for you, and that's kind of it. So really what we're talking about is like the vibe of that watch. And we really leaned heavily into like that 1970s vibe. If you haven't seen what I'm talking about, you can go to our Instagram and check out the reels from October and November of last year, and you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. Whereas for Urwerk, we really leaned into a much higher, in a sense, concept approach of what the USS Enterprise as a spaceship meant. Not the not the Captain Kirk Enterprise, but the Space Shuttle Enterprise. What that meant to, so I guess technically the SS Enterprise, pardon me, meant to space travel, Americans, and ultimately Martin Fry, like as an individual, and told that story. And I think it really gets to also the point of like why I collect watches or care about watches at all, which is, yeah, I love them as mechanical objects, and I dig them as, you know, expressions of talent and skill and beauty and all the things that I'm sure, you know, you could imagine. But I also really like them because they're personal expressions of the creator's point of view and the things that matter to them. And sometimes, you know, as with Urwork, I don't know that it really mattered if it was a UR100 or if it had been an aggregate or if it had been any, you know, or like a Dark Knight or like any other, you know, model that they made, because every model that Urwork makes is a personal and deep expression of the creative and technical beliefs of the two makers, much in the same way that Armin Strom, every watch they make is a deep and personal execution of the belief and ethos of the makers and the owners of that company. And as a result, you have to choose, like, do we want to try to tell people all about what makes Armin Strom special, which in fairness, we did in the first marketing campaign. And in this approach with the Night Ops, we're not doing that because we want to just focus on vibe again, which is this idea of like, we know that you guys either like or don't like Armin Strom. You either care or you don't care. And if you want to learn more about it, we've contributed to that global story, and there's tons out there about it. But it's really the vibe that's going to hook you, backed up by the personal truth and creative articulation of what makes somebody want to be a watchmaker in that watch. And that, I think, is where we're really learning and exploring and growing as business owners and marketers here, which is like, well, when you get to, you know, once the rubber meets the road and, you know, you're hurtling towards that launch, what do you want somebody to take away as they consider investing in this art? And what is the most compelling and concise way to tell that to them so that if somebody is excited by it, they want to take action on it?
When I worked in advertising, usually we would write these creative briefs after our client would say, we have this brand, we have this new product, now we want to advertise it. Come up with a creative brief to tell the world all about it. And that was sometimes challenging because they really hadn't thought through how they were going to bring this product to market before or during the process of developing. It was
or they were lying to themselves about who was actually the consumer of that product.
Sure. There are just a lot of things that would need to get figured out by the time you're ready to spend millions of dollars to advertise something that you maybe should have thought of earlier in the process. But that is another axe to grind for another day. What's really been helpful for me in the process we have, where we start with a creative brief and we start with a core creative idea. The watch is an expression of that. The decisions we make about the watch are a function of that. And then when it comes time to do what we do, and look, 80% of our work on a collaboration truly is in the marketing and the launching of it. Of course, we do work along the way to give input on the design of the watch. And
we're not making the watches.
But like the work and the time and the blood, sweat, and tears that we mostly pour into is around the marketing of the watch. It's the Instagram assets we make. It's the YouTube videos we create. It's the press release we write. It's the pitches that we make for the watch. To say nothing of the financial investment we make to wholesale these watches so that they're available for people who want them. And I've never had an easier job as a creative person than doing things this way, because when it comes time to do all that stuff, I already know what the idea is.
Yeah.
I already know what the brief is. I don't need to go back and ask myself, oh, well, how are we going to talk about? It's like, no. Then we go into like, okay, well, what is the right way to tell this story or express this idea in an image, in a photo shoot, in a video, or whatever else it may be. So it has made my life so much easier, which I think begs the final question here. And I'm curious for your take on it. I'll give you mine, which is, why do another edition of this watch? And for me,
sure.
for me, the reason I think I wanted to do another version of this watch, well, one is Claude brought us the idea and he said, I think there's still more to say here. And I really love this watch and I loved working on this project. And I have this idea for another version of it that I just can't let go of and I want to bring into the world. We can talk about that. But for me, I feel like we left creatively. I feel like we left some stuff out on the field in the first version of this watch, which is, I think we got and we took some bad advice, which is we were cautioned when we first were launching this watch that saying it was tactical inspired might be polarizing, might be alienating. People might misunderstand it as
taking a position on
the military or violence or the military industrial complex or even posing as stolen valor. And we're like, oh, okay, well, let's sand down the edges a little bit. We'll focus less on kind of the tactical inspiration and more on, commonalities with technical outdoor gear. And in truth, like the watch was really inspired by both, and the particulars of the design of the watch were inspired by both, but really the heart and soul of the idea and the thing that got us excited about it initially was that very tactical vibe. And I think we sanded the edges off of the initial launch of the watch because we didn't want to be polarizing. We didn't want to offend people. We got this advice, and it's our responsibility, by the way, for taking or leaving advice. We got the advice and we took it. And I always felt like, man, what if we had a little bit more fun with and really leaned into the heart and soul of the idea of this watch, which is about that badass tactical take on haute horology. And for me, when Claude approached us and said, I want to do another version of this watch, I think there's an opportunity to push this concept even further or offer a slightly different take on it. I immediately got excited for that reason because I felt like here's an opportunity, not to right or wrong, but to have another crack at bringing an idea into the world, maybe in a more pure form or pure expression of it.
Yeah. And I think that's where we landed here. I mean, look, the changes are subtle, but I think have a pretty significant impact on the design. For those who are not familiar, the Night Ops essentially takes the dial and caliber from the P.03 and encases it now still in titanium, but in DLC coated titanium with a new strap design and DLC coated hardware for the pin buckle. Now, there's two ways to look at that. One way is, well, that doesn't really seem like a lot. But the funny thing about these sorts of choices are, and I mentioned earlier with creative, sometimes you got to go to 150 and then pare it down to 110 to get it to the right place. And I think what Gabe was pointing out was we had the right idea. We had an awesome watch, but the marketing itself, we pared it down to like 80, not 100. And that was a missed opportunity, I think, to really convey what was so awesome about the watch. Here, we had the opportunity to right side it, which is to say we pushed the watch way further into the creative territory, even though it's a simple change, the case treatment, the strap, the pin buckle. But the effect of those simple changes pushes the watch really deeper into the place that we had wanted to go in the first place. And then the marketing choices that we're making around it do that too. This isn't a sports watch. It never was. It is conceptually trying, though, to say, how far can you push high watchmaking into tactical aesthetic? And the truth is, as we've learned, pretty darn far. Pretty darn far. As long as the concept at its core fundamentally works with where you're taking it. And that's what I'm so proud of with the Night Ops in general, which is it is a deeply improbable watch that conceptually, like if I was trying to describe it to somebody on day one today, like it's like it would be like going, to somebody like Kari Voutilainen and saying, I'd love for you to make like a mil-spec watch. It's like the first thought would be like, what? But then that's a really interesting question now, isn't it? About like, well, okay, well, mil-spec for what era? Mil-spec could still technically apply to like 18th century. 18th century was when we started seeing marine chronometers. Marine chronometers were mil-spec of the time. Now I'm coming up with a cool idea on the spot. But point is, like, you can take these ideas to these extremes and still end up with something awesome as long as you keep your eye on the ball. Now, some of you may look at this watch and go, blech, no way. But as we said earlier, I actually hope some of you do, because that's a good indicator that we went in the right direction. I'd also like some of you to look at it and be excited about it. Don't get me wrong. But like, it's okay if you look at it and you don't like it and you have an instant reaction to it that pushes you that way. Because to us, that demonstrates that we articulated something effectively.
Well, Asher, I think that's as good a place as any to leave it. Should we leave it there?
Absolutely. I want to say thank you to everyone who's listening. And as a final plug before we end here, if you do want to learn more about the P.03 Night Ops, not only can you see it, I'm sure, right now on our homepage at collectivehorology.com and our Instagram at Collective Horology, you should never feel shy about shooting us an email at shop@collectivehorology.com, giving us a call or a text at our number on our website, or shooting us a DM on Instagram. We are more than happy to tell you more about the watch if it interests you.
All right. Well, now you know. And Asher, you stole my job. Damn you. Thanks for listening. Openwork is, of course, a production of Collective Horology. You can find us and the Armin Strom Gravity Equal Force Night Ops online at collectivehorology.com. You can also sign up there for access to future collaborations, special releases, and events. And to get in touch with us with your feedback, your questions, or your suggestions, we love those. Just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.